Elena, a homeless girl, suddenly discovers that she is the heir to the powerful Whitmore family. As she steps into a world filled with secrets and schemes, will her love for Damien, the cold-hearted billionaire, be able to overcome all obstacles? Follow this unexpected and captivating story. On a cold winter night, drizzling rain fell as icy winds tore through the city. The deserted streets, dim streetlights, and eerie silence created a gloomy atmosphere. Elena sat curled up beneath a tree in the park, her worn-out coat offering little protection against the biting cold. She had nearly lost all hope for a better life. After years of wandering these streets, she no longer remembered how she had become homeless. Her memories of family had faded, buried beneath the pain of the past. She was alone, surviving each day on leftover scraps and makeshift shelters. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Damien Whitmore, the aloof billionaire and CEO of Whitmore Corporation, drove his luxury car along an empty road. He belonged to the world of the elite, a man of power and prestige. Yet despite his success, Damien did not have a happy life. He was cold, never allowing himself to show emotions. The only things that mattered to him were his work and career. Tonight, as usual, Damien chose to drive alone on a quiet evening. He didn't want to return to his mansion, didn't want to face the emptiness. He just wanted a moment of solitude to relax and think. It was at that moment that he drove past the park where Elena sat in the drizzle, a lonely shadow lost in the night. When Damien saw her, he felt something strange. First, he thought she was just another homeless girl, but something in her eyes made him stop his car. Elena looked up, and their eyes met. His gaze was unlike anything she had ever seen in her world. Damien opened the car door, stepped out, and approached her. "Can I help you?" he asked, his deep voice as cold as ever. Elena looked up, sensing the unfamiliarity in his tone. She could only shake her head. "No need," she replied, her voice hoarse as if she hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. Damien stood still for a moment, looking at the small, shivering girl in the cold. An inexplicable urge stirred within him. He wasn't the type to be easily moved, yet something about Elena made it impossible for him to turn away. He glanced around, saw no one else, and made a decision. "I can't leave you out here alone tonight. Get in the car." "I'll take you somewhere warmer," Damien said, his voice slightly softer than usual, though he didn't quite understand why he was saying it. Elena looked up, her eyes filled with skepticism. She had endured years of hardship and learned to be wary of people. She glanced at Damien, then at his luxury car. She didn't know what to do, but for a fleeting moment she felt that he wasn't someone who would harm her. She didn't know much about him, but there was a quiet certainty in Damien's presence that made her feel safe. Through a long pause, Elena finally nodded. "Thank you." Inside the car, silence filled the space. Damien kept his eyes on the road, yet he couldn't stop thinking about the girl beside him. Elena was unlike anyone he had encountered in the elite circles he was used to. She was simple, lacking the pretense of wealth, yet there was a quiet strength in her eyes, something he couldn't quite explain. Elena stared out the window, feeling safe yet unable to shake the weight of her painful past. She expected nothing from Damien. She was used to fending for herself, relying on no one. But sometimes in life we can't do everything alone. The car pulled up in front of a towering building, Damien's residence. "You can stay here for the night," he said, his gaze flickering over Elena briefly. "But just for one night. I don't want you to think I'm overstepping." Elena didn't respond, but she knew that regardless, one night here was better than being left out in the freezing cold. She thanked him once more, stepped out of the car, and walked inside. Damien's living room was vast, cold, and luxurious, yet it lacked any trace of warmth or family. Elena sat on the sofa, her gaze unfocused. She didn't want to think about the future, didn't want to dream about things that weren't realistic. She only wanted a peaceful night's sleep, a night without worrying about survival. But this encounter, this meeting with Damien, was only the beginning of a story she could never have anticipated. The next morning, Elena woke up in Damien's lavish guest room. Soft morning light streamed through the window, casting a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Yet an unfamiliar sensation lingered in her mind. She wasn't used to this luxury, wasn't used to the material comforts that surrounded her. She had spent her life in poverty, fighting for survival every single day. Damien was seated at the dining table, having breakfast alone when Elena entered. He didn't look up, only gesturing for her to sit. The atmosphere remained cold despite there being only 2 people in the room. "Good morning," Elena said hesitantly, unsure if she should even take a seat. "Good morning," Damien replied, his voice as calm and emotionless as ever. He continued eating, seemingly indifferent to her presence. Elena sat down, feeling out of place in this world. She couldn't ignore the stark contrast between them. He was the heir to a powerful family, and she was just a homeless girl surviving on the kindness of strangers. "Aren't you curious about why I became homeless?" Elena asked, her voice quiet, almost as if testing whether Damien actually cared. Damien set his spoon down and finally looked at her. "I don't need to know why you're here. I just want you to know that you don't have to suffer anymore." Elena said nothing, only nodding slightly. She knew Damien could provide her with everything she needed, but that wasn't what she was looking for. She wanted freedom, equality, and genuine relationships. She couldn't live in someone else's shadow forever. The morning passed in silence. Later that day, Damien took Elena to his company. "You need a fresh start," he told her as they stepped into the glass skyscraper. Pristine offices and well-dressed employees were overwhelming. Inside the HR office, Julia, a stern-looking woman, eyed Elena. "Do you have any experience?" she asked. "No," Elena admitted. Julia raised a brow but handed her a folder. "Then we'll start with something small." Elena felt out of place, but she reminded herself she had nothing to lose. By the end of the day, she realized something. She wasn't just a homeless girl anymore. For the first time, she had a chance to change her fate. The next few days at Whitmore Corporation were overwhelming for Elena. The towering glass windows, polished marble floors, and well-dressed professionals only reminded her of how different her world had been. She felt like an outsider in an unfamiliar kingdom. Though Julia had given her simple administrative tasks, she could feel the curious and sometimes judgmental stares of her coworkers. Elena had never worked in such an environment before. She was used to the unpredictability of the streets, not the structured routine of an office. Yet she did her best, determined not to let herself be defeated by self-doubt. Damien hardly spoke to her at work, maintaining his usual cold demeanor. Though he had given her an opportunity, he wasn't going to make it easy for her. One evening, as she was about to leave, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Elena, wait." She turned to see Damien standing near his office door. "Come with me," he said. Without waiting for a response, he walked ahead, expecting her to follow. She hesitated but eventually complied. He led her to an upscale restaurant, the kind of place where crystal chandeliers gleamed above polished mahogany tables. She felt out of place in her modest attire, but Damien didn't seem to care. As they sat, the air between them was filled with an unspoken tension. "Why did you bring me here?" Elena finally asked. Damien rested his elbows on the table, his piercing eyes locked on hers. "I wanted to see how you're adjusting." Elena scoffed slightly. "You mean if I'm struggling?" A ghost of a smirk touched Damien's lips. "No. If you're adapting." She sighed. "It's different. I don't belong in your world." His gaze darkened. "And yet you're here?" Elena had no response. The truth was, she didn't know where she belonged. For the first time in years, she had a stable life, but it still felt temporary, like she was living someone else's story. Just then, a woman approached their table. She was elegantly dressed, her expression poised but calculating. "Damien, it's been a while. Who's your guest?" Damien barely glanced at her. "Elena, a new employee at Whitmore Corporation." The woman studied Elena with a slow, appraising glance. "You're certainly different from the people Damien usually associates with." Elena stiffened but forced herself to remain calm. "I'm just here to work. Nothing more." The woman smirked. "Of course." After she left, Elena exhaled. "Who was that?" "Charlotte Whitmore," Damien said, swirling his wine glass. "A distant relative and a woman who enjoys meddling where she doesn't belong." Elena frowned. She looked at me like I was a puzzle she was trying to solve. Damien leaned back. "That's what the Whitmore family does. They assess people. Some with curiosity, some with suspicion. You'll get used to it." Elena wasn't sure she wanted to get used to it. The last thing she needed was to be tangled in another family's drama. But something about Charlotte's scrutinizing gaze left her unsettled, as if she knew something Elena didn't. Later that night, as Elena lay in her bed at Damien's mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not in a literal sense, but as if someone was waiting for her to make a move. She wasn't just a new employee. She wasn't just a homeless girl who had been given a second chance. She was something more. And soon, she feared, she would find out exactly what that meant. Elena arrived at work the next day with a lingering unease. The encounter with Charlotte had left a strange feeling in her chest, as if she had been pulled into something far greater than she realized. She kept her head down and focused on her work, avoiding the whispers and occasional glances from coworkers. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. By midday, Julia approached her desk. "Elena, Mr. Whitmore wants to see you in his office." Elena's stomach twisted. She nodded and made her way to Damien's office. When she entered, she found him staring out of the large glass window, his back to her. "You seem uneasy," Damien remarked, his voice calm yet unreadable. Elena hesitated before speaking. "It's Charlotte." She looked at me like she knew something I didn't. "I feel like I'm being watched." Damien finally turned to face her. "Charlotte is nosy, but she's not your concern." Elena frowned. "Then what is my concern?" "Because I feel like something is happening around me and I don't understand it." Damien walked over to his desk, his expression unreadable. "There are things you don't know yet, Elena." "But you will." She exhaled in frustration. "That's not an answer, Damien." Before he could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. The door opened, revealing Edward Whitmore, an older man with piercing blue eyes. Damien stiffened at his presence. "Elena, meet Edward Whitmore, my uncle," Damien introduced. Elena turned to Edward, who studied her carefully before offering a small nod. "It's good to finally meet you, Elena." She felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Finally." Edward took a seat, his gaze never leaving her. "You don't remember, do you?" Elena looked at Damien, then back at Edward. "Remember what?" Edward exhaled. "You're not just some girl who ended up on the streets by accident. You're part of this family. You are the rightful heir to the Whitmore fortune." Elena's breath caught in her throat. "That's impossible. I've been on my own for as long as I can remember. I don't have a family." Edward leaned forward. "You were taken away when you were very young. Your mother, Margaret Whitmore, left the family. We searched for you for years, but you disappeared. Now, by some twist of fate, you're here." Elena felt the room spinning. She gripped the edge of the chair. "You're saying I'm a Whitmore?" Damien's voice was quieter than usual. "Yes." Elena shook her head. "No. That can't be. I would remember something. Anything." Edward's expression softened. "Memories fade, especially when trauma is involved. But the truth remains, you are the rightful heir. And now that we've found you, there are decisions to be made." Elena's mind was racing. She had spent her entire life believing she was alone. Now, suddenly, she was being told she belonged to one of the wealthiest families in the country? Didn't make sense. "What decisions?" she asked warily. Edward exchanged a glance with Damien. "There are expectations that come with being a Whitmore. You would have to accept your role in the family. You would have access to everything, but also responsibilities." Elena clenched her fists. "And if I refuse?" Damien's jaw tightened, but it was Edward who answered. "Then you walk away from a life that was meant to be yours. But know this, if you refuse, others won't simply let you go." Elena's heart pounded. "What does that mean?" Edward stood. "It means that power isn't something people give up easily. The Whitmore name comes with influence, wealth, and enemies. If you accept your place, you will be protected. If you refuse, you may find yourself caught in a game you don't even realize you're playing." Elena felt like she couldn't breathe. "I need time to think." Edward nodded. "Take the time you need. But understand this, Elena, you've been found. And now you can never truly disappear again." As he walked out, Elena turned to Damien. "Did you know all along?" Damien hesitated before answering. "I had suspicions. But I didn't want to bring you into this unless I was sure." Elena stepped back, shaking her head. "I don't know who I am anymore." Damien's voice was soft but firm. You are Elena. That hasn't changed. But now you have a choice to make. That night, as she lay in bed, Elena couldn't sleep. She wasn't just a girl trying to survive anymore. She was something more, something dangerous. Elena lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with the revelation Edward had given her. She had spent her life believing she was a nobody, a girl who had been left behind by the world. And now she was being told she was the rightful heir to one of the most powerful families in the country. The weight of it pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. The next morning, she barely touched her breakfast. Damien watched her carefully but said nothing until she set her fork down. You need to talk about it. Elena shook her head. I don't even know what to say. I feel like my entire life was a lie. Damien exhaled. It wasn't a lie. It was just hidden from you. That doesn't make it better, she snapped, then sighed. I don't even know if I want this. Damien leaned forward, his gaze intense. You need to be careful, Elena. Now that you know who you are, others know too. Do you have something that people want? Elena frowned. Like what? Money? A name? Damien hesitated. Power? Influence? Being a Whitmore means having access to things most people can only dream of. And not everyone will be happy that you've returned. A cold shiver ran down her spine. You think I'm in danger? Damien didn't answer right away. I think you need to be aware of the world you're stepping into. Before she could respond, Julia walked into the room. Elena, Edward Whitmore has requested to see you. He's waiting in the study. Elena nodded and pushed back her chair. She followed Julia through the hallways until they reached an elegant study filled with dark wood furniture and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Edward stood near the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. Elena, he greeted. I trust you've had some time to think. She crossed her arms. Not enough. Edward nodded. I understand. But decisions must be made. Elena swallowed hard. What exactly do you want from me? Edward gestured for her to sit. I want you to embrace your role in this family. You were meant to inherit what your mother walked away from. There are people within our circles who will question your right to it. You must prove that you belong. And if I don't, she asked. Edward's expression darkened. Then you'll always be seen as an outsider. And outsiders don't last long in our world. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Elena's pulse quickened. Are you saying I have no choice? Edward's lips curved slightly. I'm saying that you should consider what's best for you. You've lived without security your whole life. That can change. Elena clenched her fists. I don't need money. I don't need a title. I just want to live my life. Edward leaned forward. Then why did fate bring you back to us? Why now? Think about it, Elena. You were meant for this. She stood abruptly. I need time. Edward didn't stop her as she left the study. Her heart pounded as she walked through the hallways, feeling like a caged bird. This wasn't just about family. This was about control, about power. And she wasn't sure she wanted any part of it. That evening, as she stood on the balcony, Damien joined her. He didn't speak for a moment, just watched her. Finally, he said, You don't trust them. She shook her head. Should I? Damien's jaw tightened. No. But you need to be smart. If you walk away, they won't let you do it easily. Elena turned to him, frustration in her eyes. Then what am I supposed to do? Damien met her gaze. Play their game. But on your terms. Elena wasn't sure if she could. But deep down, she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let the Whitmores decide her fate for her. Elena spent the next few days trying to navigate the world she had unknowingly stepped into. Every time she entered Whitmore Corporation, she felt the weight of eyes watching her. Some were curious, others skeptical. She knew the whispers followed her through the halls, some questioning her legitimacy, others speculating on her intentions. But she ignored them, focusing instead on understanding the family she was now connected to. One afternoon, she was summoned to a private meeting with Edward. When she arrived at his office, he was seated behind an opulent mahogany desk, his expression unreadable. Elena, please sit, he said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. She hesitated for only a second before taking a seat. Edward studied her carefully. You're adapting quicker than I expected. Elena folded her arms. I don't have much of a choice. A small smirk touched his lips. That's where you're wrong. You always have a choice. You can either accept your place in this family or reject it. But if you walk away, you must understand the consequences. She frowned. And what exactly are those consequences? Edward leaned forward, his piercing gaze holding hers. Power doesn't exist in a vacuum, Elena. If you refuse your inheritance, someone else will claim it. And they might not be as forgiving as I am. A chill ran down her spine. Forgiving? You make it sound like I owe you something. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Not me. The family. The name. Everything that comes with being a Whitmore. Whether you want it or not, you are one of us. And the world will expect you to act accordingly. Elena clenched her fists under the table. So what? I'm supposed to play a role I never signed up for? Edward's expression didn't change. You are being given an opportunity. How you use it is up to you. She exhaled, frustration simmering beneath the surface. And what if I don't want to be part of this? Edward's eyes darkened. Then you become a liability. The room suddenly felt colder. Elena forced herself to maintain eye contact. Is that a threat? Edward shrugged. It's a reality. A knock at the door interrupted them, and a moment later Damien stepped in. His eyes flickered between Elena and Edward before settling on her. Is everything all right? Elena forced a smile. Just another lesson in the politics of being a Whitmore. Edward chuckled. Damien, perhaps you can help Elena understand the weight of her position. Damien's jaw tightened. I think she understands just fine. Edward stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Think carefully, Elena. The next few days will determine your future. Elena didn't respond. She stood, nodded once, and walked out, Damien following close behind. As they stepped into the hallway, he turned to her. Are you okay? She let out a sharp breath. I'm not sure. Edward makes it sound like if I don't accept this inheritance, I'll be in danger. Damien's expression hardened. That's because you will be. She turned to him, shocked. You agree with him? Damien sighed. It's not about agreeing. It's about understanding how this world works. Power isn't something you can just walk away from. People will either want to control you or remove you. Elena swallowed hard. And what do you want? He hesitated before answering. I want you to survive. Later that night, Elena sat in her room, staring at the documents Edward had sent over. Legal papers, financial records, proof that she was indeed the heir. But what unsettled her most was a letter from her mother, Margaret Whitmore. With trembling hands, she opened it. My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, it means you found your way back. I never wanted you to be part of this world, but fate has a way of pulling us toward our destiny. The Whitmore family is not what it seems. Be careful whom you trust. There are secrets within these walls, ones that have destroyed lives. I only hope you will be stronger than I was. With love always, your mother. Elena's fingers tightened around the paper. Her mother had tried to protect her from this life. But now she was right in the middle of it. Question was, what would she do next? Elena sat in silence, the letter from her mother clutched tightly in her hands. The weight of her words pressed against her chest. Be careful whom you trust. The warning echoed in her mind, making her question everything she had seen, every person she had met in the past few weeks. She had thought the hardest part of this journey was finding out she was a Whitmore. But now she realized the real challenge was deciding what to do next. A knock on the door startled her. She quickly hid the letter in a drawer before answering. Damien stood there, his expression unreadable. You've been quiet. Elena exhaled. Just thinking. He studied her carefully. About what? She hesitated before saying, everything. My mother, the inheritance, Edward's threats, and you. Damien's eyes darkened. What about me? Elena searched his face for a hint of deception but found none. I want to trust you, Damien. But I don't know if I can. He nodded slowly. That's fair. But trust works both ways, Elena. You need to decide what you want. She bit her lip. What if I don't want any of this? Damien's gaze was unwavering. Then you'll have to fight to leave. And you'll need my help to do it. Elena felt her pulse quicken. Why would you help me? His jaw tightened. Because I know what it's like to be trapped in this world. I was born into it, but you? You were given an escape once. If you want another chance, I'll help you take it. She wanted to believe him, but a part of her still hesitated. And if I stay? Damien's expression turned grim. Then you need to be prepared. Edward won't let you simply exist in this family. He will expect loyalty. And he will test you. A shiver ran down her spine. What kind of test? One that forces you to prove whether you belong here or whether you're a threat. Before she could respond, another knock echoed through the room. This time it was Julia. Edward has requested your presence in the main hall, she said, her usual neutral tone carrying an edge of urgency. Immediately, Elena glanced at Damien before following Julia. Her heart pounded with every step. When she entered the hall, she found Edward standing near the grand fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Beside him stood Charlotte, her sharp gaze scanning Elena as if measuring her worth. Elena, Edward greeted smoothly. We have an important matter to discuss. She crossed her arms. What now? Edward smirked at her defiance. It's time for you to make a choice. Until now, you've been observing, learning. But the Whitmore name isn't just something you inherit. It's something you prove you are worthy of. Elena narrowed her eyes. And how exactly do I prove that? Charlotte finally spoke. By showing where your loyalty lies. Elena's stomach twisted. And if I refuse? Edward took a slow sip of his drink. Then you'll be seen as a liability. And liabilities don't last long in our world. A heavy silence settled over the room. The threat was clear. Elena had a decision to make, one that could define the rest of her life. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. I will decide on my own terms. Not yours. Charlotte's lips curled into a smirk. Let's see how long that lasts. Elena turned on her heel and walked away, her mind racing. She knew she had just declared war against everything the Whitmores expected from her. And she had no intention of losing.